Chapter 1, Where Grass Meets the Sky. Close your eyes. Let the modern world grow quiet. Let the hum of wires and engines soften into the distance. Imagine yourself drifting backward through time, beyond the towers of glass and steel, beyond the stone roads of empire, beyond even the memory of written borders. You are moving into a world of vast horizons, where the land opens like an ocean and the wind has no walls to strike. Before you lies the great grassland of Eurasia, immense and breathing under a pale sky. Morning light gathers slowly over the steppe. Frost lingers in the hollows, and the first warmth of dawn travels over the long grass in bands of silver and gold. Somewhere far off, horses are already awake. You hear them before you see them. The soft drumming of hooves over earth hardened by night, the snort of breath in the cold, the creak of leather, the quiet murmur of riders who know how to speak sparingly beneath an open sky. It is here in this wide and shifting world that the story of the Huns begins, though even that simple sentence is more uncertain than it sounds. For the Huns entered the written memory of Europe suddenly, like riders appearing through mist, but their deeper origins remain difficult to pin down. Ancient authors in the Roman world saw them arrive near the fringes of the Black Sea in the late 4th century, yet where they had come from before that, and by what long roads, is still a question that historians continue to approach with care. Britannica notes that the Huns appeared in southeastern Europe around 370 CE, crossing from beyond the Volga, while the possible link to the earlier Xiongnu of Inner Asia remains possible but unproven. Recent genetic research suggests that at least some elite Hunnic individuals in Europe had ties to late Xiongnu elites, but also emphasizes that the Huns who reached Europe were highly mixed and not a simple, unchanged people traveling intact across 3 centuries of distance. That uncertainty matters. It reminds us that history is not always a straight road from one named people to another. Sometimes it is a braided river of migration, alliance, imitation, conquest, marriage, loss, and reinvention. The Huns may have carried memories, styles, and lineages from the deep steppe world of Central Asia, but by the time they shook the Roman frontier, they had become something else as well, shaped by every land they crossed and every people they absorbed. In the old Roman imagination, the world beyond the frontiers was full of shadow. Officials in marble cities and generals on river borders had names for the tribes beyond their reach, but names alone gave little comfort. Across the Danube and beyond the Black Sea lay a zone of movement, negotiation, and danger. Peoples rose and broke apart there. Confederations formed and dissolved. No frontier garrison, however disciplined, could fully quiet the feeling that beyond the map was motion, and then motion became arrival. The earliest Roman descriptions of the Huns were written not by men who understood them from within, but by observers startled by their speed and transformed by fear. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, described the Huns as uncanny riders, masters of mounted warfare, men who seem almost fused to their horses. Yet Ammianus was also writing in the language of Roman ethnography, a tradition that often turned unfamiliar peoples into moral opposites of civilization itself. His account preserves important clues about mobility and horsemanship, but also reflects the rhetoric of a frightened frontier world. So let's move gently here, separating the dust of fear from the shape of reality. The Huns were not a ghostly plague descending from nowhere. They were riders, herders, raiders, diplomats, and empire builders. They could terrify cities, but they could also negotiate treaties. They inspired myth because they were fast and difficult to contain. Yet they were also part of the ancient world's long conversation between settled states and steppe societies. Rome had faced horse archer peoples before. Persia had faced them. China had faced them. The Huns were not outside history. They were one of history's recurring forces, the mobile world pressing against the monumental one. Picture now the rhythm of their life before Europe learned to fear their name. Camps that could be assembled and taken down with practiced ease. Herds grazing under immense skies. Children learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk. The smell of felt leather, smoke, and milk. The sharp tang of iron warmed by a small forge. The constant awareness that power does not lie in stone walls alone, but in movement, timing, distance, and surprise. For people of the steppe, the horizon was not a boundary. It was an invitation. This is important if we wish to understand why the Huns struck Roman observers so deeply. Rome measured power in roads, taxes, fortresses, laws, grain fleets, and city walls. The Huns measured it differently. Power moved with them. It could appear, disappear, divide, and reconcentrate. It could attack where a slow empire was weakest. It could force tribute without seeking permanent occupation of every stone town it passed. It did not need to look like Rome in order to break Rome's confidence. And confidence, once shaken, rarely returns in its old form. Across the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman world was already changing. Civil wars had drained strength. Rival emperors and ambitious generals had weakened the coherence of command. Border peoples were already in motion. The Huns did not create all the pressures that would unsettle the empire, but when they entered the story, they accelerated many of them. Entire nations would move because of them. Old balances would collapse because of them. Gold would flow across borders because of them. Roman policy itself would bend around them. Yet before the campaigns, before Attila, before the tribute and the battlefields, there was first a sensation of watching the eastern horizon and realizing that the known world had grown wider and more dangerous than expected. That is where our journey begins. We begin not in a throne room, but in a landscape, not with a proclamation, but with wind, not with certainty, but with a slow approach of riders whose past was only partly visible and whose future would be written across the final centuries of Roman power. And as dawn rises over grasslands and the horses gather under the whitening sky, the world of frontier waits without knowing exactly what is coming. Chapter 2. The Silence Before the Frontier. Long before the Huns themselves struck the Roman imagination, the lands north of the Black Sea and east of the Danube were already restless. Imagine a chain of rivers flowing westward and southward through forest, marsh, grassland, and low-rolling plain. Imagine trading paths linking distant worlds. Amber moving toward the Mediterranean, silk and metal changing hands in settlements that never became famous enough for marble inscription. Imagine Gothic kingdoms, Allan riders, Sarmatian traditions, Roman envoys, local chieftains, merchants, deserters, priests, refugees, and children born at the seam between cultures. This was not an empty edge of the map. It was a crowded threshold. Rome's frontier along the Danube looked firm from afar. There were forts, roads, signal towers, river patrols, warehouses, officers, tax officials, and long habits of negotiation. But a frontier is never just a wall. It is a membrane. Goods pass through it. People pass through it. Stories pass through it. Fear passes through it most of all. By the late 4th century, Rome had already spent generations managing the peoples beyond the river through diplomacy as much as force. Gold, titles, hostages, military service, and marriage alliances all formed part of the imperial toolkit. Some tribes fought Rome. Others served it. Some did both, sometimes in the same decade. The empire did not simply defend itself against barbarians. It recruited them, divided them, settled them, bribed them, and learned from them. Then, around 370 CE, a new pressure entered this world. According to Britannica, the Huns first overran the Alani between the Volga and Don, then overthrew the Ostrogothic power between the Don and Dniester, and by about 376 had defeated the Visigoths in the region of modern Romania, arriving at the Danubian frontier itself. In only a few years, the political geography north of Rome's eastern frontier changed with astonishing speed. For the Goths and Alans, the Huns were not merely another neighboring tribe. They were a force that altered calculations of survival. Peoples who had once dealt with Rome from relative strength now fled toward Roman territory. The famous crossing of the Goths into the empire in 376, and the chain of events that culminated in the catastrophic Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378, cannot be understood without the Huns behind them, pressing from the east. The Huns did not win Adrianople themselves, but their arrival helped set the whole tragedy in motion, in Roman memory. This was the moment when the frontier ceased to feel like a line and began to feel like a tide. Ammianus, the great historian of the late Roman world, described the Huns in terms that mixed observation with alarm. He emphasized their mobility, their rough life, their horsemanship, their skill with missile weapons, and their apparent indifference to settled agriculture. He wanted his readers to feel that these were people unlike the familiar enemies of earlier Roman wars. Yet modern historians read Ammianus carefully, not literally in every detail. His portrait belongs to a literary tradition that often exaggerated foreignness in order to sharpen Rome's sense of itself. What he gives us, through the rhetoric, is a glimpse of why the Huns seemed so hard to contain. They were fast, elusive, and difficult to trap in conventional warfare. There is a quiet tragedy in this stage of the story. When we imagine Huns entering Europe, we often picture only terror. But history also contains the grief of those pushed before them. Families on the move with carts creaking under the weight of household goods. Elders leaving burial places behind. Leaders deciding whether to resist, submit, or flee. Roman officials on the riverbank trying to process masses of desperate arrivals, while also calculating military risk. The arrival of the Huns was not a single clash. It was the beginning of a rearrangement. And rearrangements are rarely gentle. Still, the Huns were not merely destroyers of other peoples. Very quickly, they became entangled in the politics of Europe itself. Some would raid, some would extort, some would serve as allies or mercenaries. Hunnic power in this early phase seems to have been distributed among various leaders rather than resting in a single uncontested monarch. Britannica notes that whether the Huns had one overall leader in the 4th century remains disputed. Ammianus described groups led by primates, or local leading men. This detail matters because it reminds us that the Huns, like many steppe peoples, emerged politically through confederation. Their strength did not depend on the neat institutions of a settled state. It could be assembled from loyalty, prestige, plunder, kinship, and military success. Such structures could seem unstable to outsiders, yet for decades they proved fearfully effective. When the Romans imagined power, they imagined offices, seals, tax districts, and formal ranks. When steppe empires imagined power, they often imagined networks of obligation held together by a leader who could reward followers, command mobility, and turn victory into renewed allegiance. If success continued, the coalition expanded. If success faltered, it loosened. This is one reason the Huns could appear to erupt so suddenly into European history. Their visibility increased as their confederation sharpened, and yet the silence before the frontier broke was not total. There had been rumors, hints, names half heard. Rome had long experience with the peoples of the steppe. Still, there is something haunting in the way the Huns enter the Roman narrative, not as petitioners, not as subjects, not as a distant embassy, but as pressure. Pressure on the Goths, pressure on the Danube, pressure on Roman confidence. You can almost feel it in the records. Administrators begin to respond to movement rather than design it. Emperors react. Armies redeploy. The empire begins to spend strength not on expansion, but on adjustment. And on the other side of that adjustment rides a people who would soon learn not only how to frighten Rome, but how to make Rome pay. For the Huns were about to discover that the empire beyond the river was not simply a target of plunder. It was a fountain of gold. Chapter 3, Wolves at the River. If the first arrival of the Huns felt like a sudden storm, their next phase was quieter, more calculating, and in some ways more dangerous. Rome had long known how to fight enemies. What it feared even more at times was being compelled to bargain from weakness. Once the Huns had altered the balance north of the Danube, they became not only raiders but players in the diplomacy of empire. Their reputation for violence made their friendship valuable and their hostility expensive. Picture the Danube frontier at dusk. Watchfires glow red beside the water. Roman officers in heavy cloaks examine reports from scouts and interpreters. Across the river, in the darkening land beyond, other fires answer, scattered like fallen stars on the plain. Somewhere between those fires move merchants with pack animals, envoys under safe conduct, deserters, smugglers, and men who speak several languages because survival has made them fluent. Here, war and diplomacy are not opposites. They are part of the same landscape. For half a century after the defeat of the Visigoths, Britannica tells us the Huns extended their power over many Germanic peoples in Central Europe and also fought for the Romans. This is worth lingering over. The Huns were not merely an external menace, striking the empire from outside. They were drawn into Roman civil and military struggles, serving at times as allies and hired force. Like many frontier peoples, they were woven into the empire's own internal conflicts. That pattern had consequences. Rome learned more about the Huns, even as it became more dependent on them in certain theaters. And the Huns, in turn, learned Roman weaknesses, political fractures, and the immense value of imperial wealth. Among the Romans who grew up understanding the world beyond the frontier was Flavius Aetius. later one of the most important men in the Western Empire. Britannica records that in his youth, Aetius spent time as a hostage with Alaric and later with the Huns, gaining direct knowledge of the leading tribal peoples of his day. This detail is easy to pass over, but it matters deeply. Some of the key figures who would one day stand against the Huns had once lived among them, learned their habits, and perhaps understood better than most Romans that these were not wild phantoms but political actors with sharp instincts. The hostage system, so common in antiquity, was one of the frontier's quiet schools. Sons of elite families were exchanged, not always brutally, but strategically. They lived among foreign courts, absorbing manners, military customs, and human familiarity. Such arrangements were designed to secure trust. Yet they also created men who could read more than one world. In the Hunnic sphere, power slowly consolidated. By 432, Britannica says the leadership of the various Hunnic groups had been centralized under a single king, Rua or Rugula. This was a turning point. Confederated strength became more clearly directed. A people who had already proven dangerous through mobility and regional pressure now moved towards stronger political unity. Rua understood something fundamental. Rome's fear could be turned into regular revenue. The empire was wealthy even in decline. Its cities held treasure. Its tax system still functioned. Its courts still valued peace. And its eastern government in particular would often pay heavily to avoid devastation on the Balkan frontier. A frontier raid could bring plunder. A treaty could bring annual gold. The most skilled enemy was the one who knew when not to burn a city, because a living city could be taxed more than a ruined one. This is one of the great themes of Hunnic power. Their violence was real, but was often tethered to calculation. When Rua died in 434, leadership passed to his nephews Bleda and Attila. Their first known action, according to Britannica, was a negotiation of a treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire at Margus, by which the Romans agreed to double the subsidies they had been paying the Huns, and to pay 700 pounds of gold annually. Already, the old language of subsidy and alliance was becoming tribute in all but name. Think about the quiet humiliation contained in that agreement. An empire accustomed to demanding tribute from others was now doubling payments to a power beyond its borders. Every weight of gold sent northward carried more than economic value. It acknowledged a changed hierarchy of fear. And yet, as so often in history, treaties did not settle the matter. They merely arranged the next stage. From 435 to 439, Attila's movements are obscure, but Britannica suggests he may have been subduing peoples to the north or east of his dominions. That fits the broader logic of steppe empire. A ruler's authority had to be renewed through success. Followers expected gain. Subject peoples needed managing. Rival elites needed watching. The Hunnic world was not static behind the frontier. It was consolidating, sharpening, preparing. Meanwhile, the Eastern Romans, preoccupied elsewhere, did not always meet the terms they had promised. Late imperial government was often stretched thin, juggling Persian concerns in the east, military needs in the west, religious controversy, court intrigue, and the endless cost of frontier defense. Delayed payments, broken assurances, and local provocations were common. The Huns noticed. So before the great name campaigns of Attila, before Gaul and Italy, there was a slow gathering pressure along the river. The Huns learned that Rome could be squeezed. Rome learned that the Huns could not simply be bought off forever. The Danube became less a border than a lever, and in the spaces between war and peace, there was another transformation taking place. The Huns were becoming legible enough to frighten Europe properly. Their leaders acquired names. Their demands acquired form. Their armies appeared not as scattered raids, but as expressions of organized authority. This is how a rumor becomes a power. This is how a frontier people becomes an empire in the minds of its enemies. And in the years to come, one of those names, Attila, would grow so large that it would eclipse almost all the others, until the Huns themselves seemed in later memory to be only his shadow. But before we meet him in full, we should pause by the riverside and listen to the deeper machinery of fear. Gold counted out, hostages exchanged, scouts reporting movement in the grass, and Roman officials realizing that the old balance has already slipped. The wolves are not only at the river now, they are learning how the granaries are filled. Chapter 4, Gold, Hostages, and the Art of Fear. Empires often imagine that war is decided in battle. In truth, much of power is worked out in rooms where men sit across from one another, measuring silence, prestige, and price. The Huns understood this with remarkable clarity. From a Roman point of view, the payments made to frontier peoples could be described as diplomacy, as subsidies, as the price of alliance, as a practical mechanism in a difficult world. But from the Hunnic point of view, those same payments could be read as tribute, as proof that the empire feared what lay beyond the river. In such matters, language follows power. The side that grows stronger gets to decide what the payment means. Under Rua, and then more forcefully under Bleda and Attila, fear itself became a political instrument. The Huns did not need to conquer every Roman province in order to dominate Roman decision-making. They needed only to demonstrate repeatedly that they could devastate provinces when crossed, move rapidly enough to evade set-piece response, and exact a cost that made payment seem rational. This was not mindless destruction. It was strategic intimidation. The treaty at Margus in 434 gave the Huns immediate advantage. Britannica reports that the Eastern Romans agreed to double their subsidies and pay 700 pounds of gold each year. But there is a strange fragility in treaties founded on unequal fear. They require constant reaffirmation. If either side believes the other has become distracted or weak, the agreement begins to fray. And the Eastern Empire was often distracted. The court at Constantinople was rich, ceremonious, sophisticated, and heavily defended by walls that seemed almost invulnerable. Yet walls do not protect the countryside. A city may survive while provinces burn. And for the Huns, it was often the countryside, the undefended towns, the lines of supply, and the psychology of repeated assault that mattered most. In 441, when Roman forces were occupied elsewhere, Attila launched a major assault on the Danubian frontier. Britannica records that important cities, including Singidunum, modern Belgrade, were captured and razed. In 443, he renewed the attack, driving through cities such as Nisus and Serdica, and advancing so far that the empire was forced into a harsher settlement, including 6,000 pounds of gold in arrears and an annual tribute of 2,100 pounds. If you slow the scene down, you begin to understand why these campaigns matter beyond immediate devastation. Every destroyed city meant interrupted taxation. Every refugee movement strained administration. Every Roman defeat told subject peoples that imperial protection might fail. Every additional pound of gold sent northward announced the same lesson twice. Once to the Huns, and again to everyone else watching. Yet to picture the Huns only as fire and galloping horses is to miss their political sophistication. Their leaders managed an expanding network of subordinate peoples. They negotiated with Roman diplomats. They understood the value of rank, gifts, personal audiences, and carefully staged displays of power. Even in later literary tradition, Attila appears not only as a ravager, but as a ruler whose court drew embassies from multiple peoples. That suggests not chaos, but centrality. Gold helped make that centrality possible. Britannica notes that since the time of Ammianus, the Huns had acquired huge sums of gold through treaties, plunder, and ransom. This influx of wealth altered their society. Military leadership became hereditary within Attila's family, and Attila governed through chosen men called Logades, whose role included collecting tribute and food from subject peoples. Here the shape of empire becomes clearer. The Huns were not merely living off sudden raids. They were organizing extraction on a broad scale. The old Roman prejudice imagined nomads as incapable of administration. Yet every successful steppe empire disproved that assumption in its own way. Administration need not look like Roman bureaucracy to be real. It can travel along personal networks, tribute channels, hostage relationships, and delegated authority. It can operate through loyalty rather than office, through mobile courts rather than fixed capitals. The hostage system remains central in this world. Hostages were leverage embodied in flesh. They were insurance, diplomacy, education, and warning all at once. A child or noble youth placed in another court was never simply a prisoner. He was a living knot in the fabric of obligation. Such exchanges helped the Huns understand Rome, and Rome understand the Huns, though understanding did not always produce peace. There is a human dimension here that often disappears beneath the grand narrative of invasion. Imagine a Roman-born youth hearing Hunnic speech every day until it no longer sounds foreign. Imagine a Hunnic noble studying the manners of Roman diplomacy and recognizing how much ceremony can conceal anxiety. Imagine interpreters, cooks, scribes, wives, and traders moving between these worlds, carrying gestures and habits across the border even while armies face one another. History at the frontier is rarely pure. It is mixed, adaptive, improvisational. Modern archaeology has only deepened this picture. Research highlighted by the University of Cambridge suggests that in 5th century Pannonia, some individuals shifted over the course of their lives between settled agriculture and more mobile, Hun-associated pastoral lifeways, while others moved the opposite way. Rather than a simple clash between fixed Romans and wandering Huns, the frontier sometimes produced coexistence, imitation, and practical exchange. This should not soften the reality of Hunnic warfare. Cities did burn. Provinces were ravaged. But it should broaden our understanding. Fear was not the only thing crossing the frontier. Waves of life crossed too. And now, somewhere in this widening system of tribute, intimidation, and cultural exchange, one ruler is rising above the rest. His brother still lives. Their power is still shared. But the chroniclers will remember only one name with lasting force. Soon we will leave the abstract machinery of empire and step into a place seen by human eyes. A Hunnic settlement. A wooden hall, a royal wife seated among embroidered cloth, a bath built with imported stone, and a ruler whose personal austerity impressed even those who feared him. In the quiet after gold has been counted and treaties sealed, history sometimes gives us something rarer than battle. It gives us a visit. Chapter 5. A village of polished wood. There are few gifts in ancient history more precious than an eyewitness. Much of what later generations believed about the Huns came through rumor, hostile literary tradition, or legends shaped long after the events. But in the year 449, a Greek-speaking diplomat and historian named Priscus traveled as part of an embassy to the court of Attila. What he wrote has survived in fragments, and those fragments are among the most vivid windows we possess into the Hunnic world. So let's go there slowly. Imagine a long journey north in the Roman sphere, across lands where the names of villages change, where interpreters move in and out of the party, where uncertainty deepens with every mile. Dust gathers on cloaks and boots. Supplies are counted carefully. The sky grows bigger. Then, after distance and delay, the embassy approaches a large village, one of Attila's favored residences. Priscus describes Attila's residence as more splendid than his other houses, made of polished boards and surrounded by a wooden enclosure built more for appearance than defense. That detail is quietly revealing. A ruler who feared immediate assault would prioritize walls for protection. A ruler confident in his dominance might build to impress. Nearby stood the residence of Onagesius, a powerful noble, and even a bathhouse built with imported stone from Pannonia, a reminder that the Hunnic court was not cut off from Roman techniques, luxuries, or captives skilled in building them. This is not the image many later fantasies prefer. Not a horde without structure, but a courtly space. Not formless barbarism, but arranged architecture, hierarchy, and display. Priscus also visited the enclosure of Attila's wife, Crica. There, he found rooms furnished with woolen mats, servants standing nearby, and maidens seated on the floor embroidering colored linen cloths meant to adorn garments. The scene is domestic, almost intimate. It allows us to see, for a moment, not only war and tribute but household life. Female labor, rank, and material culture. There is something calming in the texture of this world when viewed at close range. The polish with catching afternoon light. The muted colors of woven fabric. The smell of warm boards, wool, smoke, leather, and cooked grain. Outside, perhaps, horses shifting in their tethers. Inside, the patient rhythm of hands at needlework. History is often remembered in battles, yet entire civilizations are carried by these quieter motions. Priscus noticed food and drink as well. In the villages, he writes, the embassy received millet instead of Roman-style grain, and drinks such as mead and a barley beverage called cam. Those details may seem small, but food is one of the surest markers of world and habit. Millet belongs to a different ecology than Mediterranean wheat. It ripens quickly, travels well, and suits the rhythms of steppe and frontier life. Modern archaeological research from Pannonia makes this even more intriguing. Cambridge scholars found isotopic evidence suggesting that some individuals in the frontier zone adopted diets associated with mobile herding, rich in animal protein and millet, while others moved toward more settled agricultural diets. The Hunnic age, it seems, was not only an age of invasion, but also one of practical adaptation. Priscus also saw public life at work. Attila emerged from his residence amid commotion and expectation, stood before his house, and heard disputes brought before him. Litigants approached. Judgments were given. Ambassadors from other peoples were received. Here again, we see rulership not merely as rating, but as arbitration. A king's authority is confirmed not only by battlefield success, but by his ability to settle quarrels, hear petitions, and place himself at the center of many dependent relationships. And then came the banquet. It is one of the most famous scenes in late antique history. Guests were seated according to rank. The places on Attila's right regarded as most honorable. Wine was served for ritual toasts. Tables were brought in. Rich food appeared. Silver plate and gold goblets were laid before the guests and barbarian nobles alike. But Attila himself, Priscus says, ate only meat from a wooden trencher. His cup was of wood. His clothing was simple, notable chiefly for being clean. Unlike many around him, his sword, shoes, and horse gear were not decorated with gold or gems. It is difficult to overstate how important this portrait became. For Roman and later European readers, Attila had often been imagined as excess incarnate, a devouring force. Yet Priscus presents a ruler whose personal habits were marked by restraint. Not kindness, necessarily, not gentleness, but self-command. This contrast is one of the keys to understanding Hunnic power. Attila was surrounded by wealth, but he used simplicity as theater and as principle. A ruler who shows that he could possess gold yet does not need to glitter and it communicates something potent. That wealth belongs to his power, not the other way around. As evening deepened, torches were lit. 2 singers came forward and chanted songs of Attila's victories. A dwarf named Zircon performed comic entertainment that sent the hall into laughter. Priscus records that Attila remained largely impassive, his expression scarcely changing, except when his youngest son, Ernest, appeared and the ruler touched the boy's cheek with calm affection. That single gesture, almost tender in its stillness, has outlived the laughter in the hall. This is why eyewitness testimony matters. It interrupts caricature. It gives us atmosphere instead of slogans. It reminds us that even the most feared figures in history sat in rooms, ate meals, loved children, listened to songs, and shaped their image deliberately. And as night closed around the village of polished wood, and the embassy watched the ruler whom Rome feared, the Huns ceased, for a few hours, to be only a force at the frontier. They became a society, visible in lamplight. Chapter 6. The Wooden Cup of Attila. History remembers Attila as if he emerged fully formed, already legendary, already terrible, already named the scourge of empire. But real rulers are made before they are mythologized. Attila inherited power rather than discovering it in solitude. When Rua died in 434, Attila ruled jointly with his brother Bleda. The 2 nephews together negotiated with Constantinople, received subsidies, and presided over a growing confederation whose authority stretched across a vast swath of Central and Eastern Europe. Only later, around 445, did Attila become sole ruler after Bleda's death, which ancient and later sources often presented as murder. Britannica states bluntly that Attila murdered his brother and thereafter ruled the Huns as an autocrat. Whether one lingers on the accusation or not, the political result is clear. Shared authority ended. The Hunnic world now had one dominant center. The image of the wooden cup at the banquet helps us think about Attila's character. Priscus observed a man who cultivated personal simplicity amid abundance. Later tradition often preferred grander and darker portraits, but the eyewitness account suggests discipline, composure, and a carefully managed royal presence. He did not need ornament to impress. His authority was already established in behavior of everyone around him. What kind of ruler does this suggest? Perhaps one who understood that empire among the Huns depended less on ceremonial distance than on visible command. A steppe ruler had to distribute wealth, reward followers, intimidate rivals, negotiate with foreigners, and remain unmistakably central to every active decision. If he appeared weak, coalitions frayed. If he appeared decadent, He risked resembling the very empires he extracted wealth from. Attila's plain cup and clean garments may have expressed an ethic admired in his world. Strength without softness. This does not make him a romantic hero. It makes him legible. He inherited not a tidy kingdom, but a network of peoples held together by opportunity and pressure. Some were Huns in a narrower sense. Others were Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and many more groups folded into Hunnic power. Such an empire required constant motion, tribute collection, punitive campaigns, arbitration, gift-giving, marriage politics, and deliberate performances of invincibility. Attila proved extraordinarily good at this. Britannica describes him as a ruler of a dominion stretching from the Alps and the Baltic in the west toward the Caspian in the east. The exact limits of steppe empires are always difficult to draw with precision, because authority often fades gradually rather than stopping at firm borders. But the scale itself is revealing. Attila did not rule a raiding band. He ruled a political order large enough to frighten both halves of the Roman world. His reputation was reinforced by success. In 441, and again in 443, he struck the Eastern Empire hard, taking cities and forcing new payments. In 447, he launched another great campaign, this time devastating the Balkans and pushing southward into Greece as far as Thermopylae. Even when he suffered losses, he remained capable of imposing terms. This rhythm of attack, negotiation, and renewed extraction is the essence of Attila's power. And yet the most arresting measure of his success may be psychological. He became a presence in Roman political imagination. Courts discussed him. Diplomats traveled to him. Rival factions maneuvered with him in mind. Princesses and bishops, generals and tax officials, all move in a world with the possibility of Attila-shaped decisions. That kind of influence belongs to more than a warrior. It belongs to a geopolitical fact. There is also something almost theatrical in Attila's self-presentation. Prisca saw a man who remained composed during laughter, music, and the shifting drama of a banquet hall. That control of the face, that refusal to surrender to spectacle even while presiding over it, must have deepened the impression he made on visitors. Many rulers seek magnificence. Attila seems to have sought gravity. To understand why later centuries remembered him so fiercely, we must also remember what the Roman world was becoming. The 5th century was an age of thinning certainty. Central authority in the West was fragile. Armies depended increasingly on federate allies and the personal skill of a few generals. The East remained wealthier and more stable, but even Constantinople preferred paying tribute to inviting repeated devastation. Into this uncertain age rode a ruler who appeared to embody momentum itself. No wonder legend gathered around him. In Germanic epic, he would become Etzel. In Norse tradition, Attila. In Christian memory, often a chastising force sent against a sinful world. Yet beneath all these afterimages stand the historical Attila, ruler of the Huns from 434 to 453, a persistent negotiator, an exacting enemy, a man of plain personal style and immense public consequence. We are often tempted to think that simplicity equals honesty in history, that if a ruler dresses plainly, he must somehow be closer to truth than rulers in silk and purple. But the wooden cup need not mean humility in our modern moral sense. It may instead mean mastery over display. Attila could afford to disdain luxury because luxury came to him regardless. He could appear austere because his dominance was visible in the tribute of empires and the gold on everyone else's table. And that is a subtler kind of magnificence. Soon, his court would no longer be only a destination for embassies. It would become the center from which the next great storms rolled outward, deeper into Balkans, westward into Gaul, southward into Italy. But for a moment, let us remain in the torchlight of the hall and listen to the cups being raised, the songs of victory being chanted, and the wooden vessel in the king's hand, plain as a branch, steady as policy. Sometimes history can be held in an object, and sometimes an empire is reflected not in the gold a ruler wears, but in the gold he makes others carry to him. Chapter 7. The Empire of Many Peoples. By the middle of the 5th century, the Hunnic world had become far larger and more intricate than the simple word Huns can comfortably contain. When Roman writers spoke of the Huns, they often described them as if they were a single, unified ethnicity, moving with one will across the map. But steppe empires are rarely so simple. They are often coalitions, layered and multilingual, built from conquest, diplomacy, and incorporation. Under Attila, Hunnic power rested on a wide assemblage of subject and allied peoples, Goths, Gepids, Alans, and others, each bringing their own martial traditions, political interests, and leaders to the structure of empire. This matters because it changes how we imagine Hunnic strength. It was not just the speed of horse archers or ferocity of raids. It was the ability to command a broader political machine. At the center stood Attila and his court, but around that center stretched a hierarchy of nobles, military companions, tributary rulers, family alliances, and delegated administrators. Britannica mentions Attila's logades, selected men responsible for collecting food and tribute from subject peoples. This suggests an empire that knew how to translate military success into sustained extraction, and extraction required roads of information as much as roads of stone. Messages had to move, demands had to be carried, hostages had to be guarded, food for men and horses had to be found. Local rulers had to be watched for signs of wavering loyalty. Steppe empires are sometimes imagined as weightless, but in truth they are logistical organisms of great subtlety. They do not build in marble first. They build in dependency. The Huns also lived in closer contact with settled populations than older fantasies once allowed. The Cambridge research on Pannonian graves has shown that in some frontier communities individuals shifted between mobile pastoral and settled agricultural lifeways, suggesting not an absolute divide but a zone of adaptation. Some farmers seem to have taken on more mobile, Hun-like patterns. Some people associated with Hunnic culture adopted settled habits. The frontier, far from being a line between pure identities, was often a place of practical blending. Even the archaeology of elite burials complicates the old story. Recent genomic work reported through the EU's Cordis platform suggests that while some elite individuals in European Hun period graves show ties to late Xiongnu elites of Inner Asia, the broader population under Hunnic rule in Europe was highly diverse, and their overall genetic footprint outside certain elite contexts was limited. In other words, the Hunnic Empire in Europe appears to have been politically powerful without being demographically overwhelming. That is a striking thought. An empire can reshape a continent, even if it does not replace most of the people living there. It is one of the oldest patterns in history. A comparatively small but mobile and dominant military elite can reorder tribute flows, alliances, migration routes, and military obligations far beyond its own numbers. The Huns were masters of that kind of leverage, and yet their power still depended on performance. Victories had to continue. Tribute had to flow. Subject peoples had to believe that staying within Attila's orbit was safer or more profitable than leaving it. Once that belief failed, the structure could loosen rapidly. For now, though it held, imagine the sound of such an empire in motion. Horses in the dark before dawn, iron bits clicking, wagons rumbling, different languages spoken over the same fire, orders translated from one tongue to another. Children growing up in camps where Roman coins passed through hands that also handled step bridles and Germanic swords. Priests of different traditions praying under the same sky. Captives learning new loyalties. Traders following the court because power itself was a market. This was not a civilization without texture. It was full of texture. Priscus gives us glimpses of this complexity. He notes prominent figures such as Onagesius, men second only to Attila in influence, and he encounters not just warriors but women, servants, artisans, entertainers, interpreters, and even a former Roman who had found a new life among the Huns. These fragments reveal a courtly world, social rank, domestic economy, and personal ambition. The former Roman in Priscus's account is especially poignant. During the embassy, Priscus spoke with a man of Greek background who had once lived under Roman rule, but now preferred life among the Huns. The man contrasted Roman legal harassment and tax burdens with the relative quiet he claimed to enjoy after war among the Huns. We should not romanticize the statement too quickly. One individual's voice cannot summarize a whole society. Yet the exchange reminds us that Rome's superiority was not always experienced equally by all who lived under it. Such moments are important in bedtime history because they soften the hard outlines of textbook myth. The Huns were not monsters outside civilization, nor were the Romans always the serene guardians of order they liked to imagine themselves to be. Between them lay a field of human choice, compromise, fear, and adaptation. Still, the empire of Attila was sharpened by war. Its wealth came heavily from coercion. Its prestige rested on repeated demonstrations that resistance was costly. Even coexistence on the frontier unfolded in the shadow of possible violence. And violence was returning. For though Attila's court could appear orderly and even ceremonious, the relationship of the Eastern Empire remained unstable. Tribute could not buy permanent calm. Negotiation was never far from accusation. The Balkan provinces, already scarred, would soon feel the Hunnic presence again. The empire of many peoples had gathered itself. Now it would move. Chapter 8. Fire along the Balkan Road. If the Hunnic court offered moments of stillness, the Balkan campaigns revealed the full force of motion. Picture southeastern Europe in the mid-5th century. River towns, fortified cities, roads laid down by Roman engineers centuries earlier, churches rising inside walls, granaries stocked against winter, officials drafting reports, farmers working fields beneath the illusion that imperial protection still holds. Then imagine that protection giving way not all at once, but city by city, road by road, under pressure of an enemy who does not fight on Rome's preferred terms. In 441, Attila struck the Danubian frontier, while the Eastern Empire was occupied elsewhere. Singidunum fell. Other towns followed. A brief truce in 442 bought only time. In 443, the Huns returned, capturing and destroying cities, such as Nisus and Serdica, pushing deep into imperial territory and forcing a peace settlement that dramatically increased Roman payments. Then, in 447, Attila launched another great invasion, devastating the Balkans once more and driving south toward Greece as far as Thermopylae. These are the facts, clear and hard, but let's enter them more gently. Roads that had once carried tax grain and military dispatches now carried refugees. Bells rang from churches not for feast days, but for warning. Smoke darkened the horizon where towns had stood intact a week earlier. Roman soldiers marched and countermarched, sometimes bravely, often too late, against the Theodosian walls of Constantinople itself. Hunnic horse archers could do little, yet the walls of the capital were not the walls of provinces. A city too strong to storm could still preside over a countryside stripped raw. This is one of the bitter truths of imperial decline. A capital may survive magnificently, while the regions that feed it suffer repeatedly. The Balkan provinces became, in this period, a landscape of interruption. Fields went untilled. Tax registers lost their meaning. Roads were broken. Families vanished into flight. The memory of security thinned. And Attila, even when unable to take Constantinople, emerged stronger from the negotiations that followed. Gold flowed north again. Visual: refugees on a Roman road at sunset, ox carts and broken milestones, smoke in the distance. Priscus later preserves the atmosphere of these diplomatic years, when the Eastern court and Attila's representatives circled one another in a dance of accusation and concession. It was during this phase, in 449, that Priscus joined the Roman embassy to Attila. His narrative preserves the complicated texture of relations between them. Suspicion, ceremonial courtesy, rumor of assassination plots, carefully staged audiences, and the slow bargaining that follows devastation. Among the most memorable episodes in Priscus's account is his conversation with a Greek-speaking former Roman living among the Huns. The man had once been a merchant in Viminatium, a city wrecked by war, and after capture and a reversal of fortune, he chose to remain with the Huns. He contrasted life under Roman taxation and official harassment with the quieter, less burdened life he claimed to enjoy among his new masters once war had passed. Again, we must not turn one testimony into an absolute truth, but it is an extraordinary reminder that the imperial system could feel oppressive to those at its margins. For a bedtime listener, this voice matters. It reminds us that history is not only written by emperors and chroniclers, it is also lived by those who change allegiance because one system has failed them and another, however harsh, offers room to breathe. The Eastern Empire was not helpless. It endured. It negotiated. It rebuilt where it could. It remained wealthier and administratively stronger than the West. But in relation to Attila, it was reactive. His campaigns exposed the difficulty of defending long frontiers against highly mobile enemies. They also demonstrated the limits of Roman military adaptation. Even when Roman forces fought effectively, the Huns often retained the initiative. There's also a moral transformation in how repeated invasion changes society. The first raid shocks. The second teaches dread. By the third, the ordinary patterns of life begin to warp around expectation. Villages hide stores. Officials flee sooner. Gossip becomes strategy. Children grow up knowing the word Hun not as a distant ethnonym, but as a possible sound in the night. And yet Attila's use of terror was never wholly blind. He wanted settlements. He wanted leverage. He wanted acknowledgement of superiority. Even devastation functioned as communication. This is why the campaigns along the Balkan Road were so consequential. They did not merely damage Roman provinces. They proved that Attila could reach deep, force payment, and survive diplomatic aftermath with prestige intact. From Constantinople's view, the problem had not gone away. It had become a structure. Still, the East would not be Attila's final stage. Beyond the Balkans, another set of possibilities was forming. In the Western Empire, political instability, personal appeals, dynastic tensions, and the ambitions of great generals opened a path that would draw Attila toward Gaul. A ring would be sent. A claim would be made. Old alliances would twist. And the ruler who had already bent the East to costly negotiation would turn his attention toward the West, where his name would become inseparable from one of the most famous battles of late antiquity. The roads of the Balkans still smolder, but already, across Europe, another road is beginning to open. Chapter 9, A Ring Sent Westward. History often turns on grand causes: climate, migration, military systems, economic strain. But sometimes, folded into those vast movements, one finds a small and glittering object, a ring. In 450, according to later sources summarized by Britannica and World History Encyclopedia, Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, sent a message and her ring to Attila, hoping to escape an arranged marriage. Attila chose to interpret the gesture as a proposal and demanded Honoria as his bride, along with half the Western Empire as her dowry. Whether this was cynical opportunism or a genuine exploitation of ambiguity hardly matters now. The result was political gold. Attila had found a claim, or at least a pretext, to intervene in Western affairs. Yet Honoria's ring alone did not bring the Huns into Gaul. Larger conditions prepared the way. The Western Empire was fragile, increasingly dependent on the skill of its generals and the cooperation of federate peoples. At its center stood Flavius Aetius, the dominant military statesman of the age, a man who had spent part of his youth among the Huns and knew their methods from experience. Britannica describes him as a commanding influence over Valentinian III and the key architect of Western policy in this era. Aetius is one of those late Roman figures who seem almost carved out of necessity. In a stronger age, he might have been merely a successful general. In a weakening age, he became the hinge on which survival turned. He had fought Franks, Visigoths, Burgundians. He had navigated court intrigue and provincial revolt. Above all, he understood that the West could not face Attila alone. Attila's motives for invading Gaul in 451 remain debated. Britannica notes that previously he seems to have been on friendly terms with Aetius, and the exact motives for the campaign are not fully recorded. Perhaps the Honoria affair gave him justification. Perhaps Western politics presented opportunity. Perhaps pressure from subject allies and the desire for new plunder and prestige played their part. History rarely offers a single cause when several will do. What matters is that the Hunnic host moved west. In the spring of 451, Attila entered Gaul. Cities trembled. Rumor outran the army itself. He aimed or claimed to aim at the Visigothic kingdom centered on Toulouse. Though such statements can also function as diplomatic positioning. The Western Empire, faced with a danger too large for any one faction, did what weakening states often must do when survival is on the line. It built a coalition. Aetius reached an agreement with Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths. This alliance was extraordinary because it united former rivals under the pressure of a greater enemy. Romans, Visigoths, Alans, Burgundians, and others gathered into one improvised force. It was not a seamless army. It was a necessity stitched together against momentum. Here one can feel the larger pattern of late antiquity. The old empire no longer wins by Roman legions alone. It survives through coalition, negotiation, and the ability of men like Aetius to persuade one barbarian power to help stop another. Rome, in a sense, remains central less by commanding absolutely than by orchestrating others. Attila nearly took Aurelian of modern Orleans. Britannica, says the Huns, had already gained a footing inside the city before Aetius, and Theodoric forced them to withdraw. That detail has the tense quality of a gate closed at the last moment. Had the coalition arrived later, the psychological shape of the campaign might have been very different. So now the stage is set for one of the most famous confrontations of the age. Yet even here, certainty is elusive. The exact site of the coming battle is disputed. Casualty figures in traditional accounts are likely exaggerated. The event survives through layers of memory, pride, and literary shaping. Still, beneath the uncertainty lies a firm truth. Attila was checked in Gaul by a coalition that would have seemed improbable without him. Before we step onto that battlefield, pause for a moment with the strange elegance of the chain of causes. A woman in dynastic distress sends a ring. A warlord reads as advantage. A Roman general who once knew the Huns from within gathers old enemies into alliance. A threatened city holds just long enough. Across Gaul, in the long light of spring, armies move toward each other through fields that do not yet know their names will live in history. And somewhere, perhaps among all the banners and dust, there are ordinary people listening for hoofbeats and praying that they will pass elsewhere. But history is drawing inward now. Tor placed the sources called the Catalonian Plains. There, by evening, the question will no longer be whether Attila can reach the west. It will be whether the west can stop him. Chapter 10. The Long Day on the Catalonian Plains. The battle is famous, but like many famous things in history, it is partly veiled. We call it the Battle of the Catalonian Plains or the Catalonian Fields, fought in 451. Britannica notes that the exact location is uncertain, with views divided between the regions near Chalons and Troyes in Champagne. Traditional casualty numbers are probably exaggerated. Some scholars argue over whether the result was a clear Roman victory, a draw, or a more ambiguous strategic check. Yet the broad outline remains. Attila's advance in Gaul was stopped. Let us imagine the day not as a map of arrows, but as a slow tightening of air. The field is open enough for cavalry to matter, yet broken enough that position matters too. Dust lifts under thousands of feet. Standards tremble in the wind. The Roman-led coalition forms not as a perfect machine, but as a pact of necessity. Romans under Aetius, Visigoths under Theodoric, Alans and others held intense alignment. Across from them stands Attila with the Hunnic corps and the many peoples bound into his empire, including Ostrogoths and Gepids. This is not merely Rome against the Huns. It is Europe in a late antique sense, fighting over what shape its next century will take. Aetius knew he could not afford panic. The coalition's strength was also its weakness. Allied armies can fracture if confidence fails. Theodoric, the Visigothic king, brought vital weight to the Roman side, but also his own prestige and interests. Attila, for his part, still carried the aura of near invincibility. Even if earlier campaigns had cost him, he remained a man who had extorted gold from Constantinople and burned to the Balkans. As the afternoon advanced, both sides struggled for tactical ground. Much of what later writers describe as difficult to disentangle from heroic coloring. But the battle was certainly fierce. Theodoric was killed, a heavy blow amid the chaos. Yet his death did not collapse the Allied line. Somehow the coalition held together long enough to blunt Attila's momentum. By nightfall, Attila had withdrawn into his camp. This fact lies at the heart of the battle's ambiguity. He was not annihilated. He was not paraded captive. His army remained dangerous enough that Aetius did not simply storm the camp and end the Hunnic threat in one stroke. Yet Attila soon retreated from. By nightfall, Attila had withdrawn into his camp. This fact lies at the heart of the battle's ambiguity. He was not annihilated. He was not paraded captive. His army remained dangerous enough that Aetius did not simply storm the camp and end the Hunnic threat in one stroke. Yet Attila soon retreated from Gaul, and that retreat gave the battle its enduring meaning. However one judges the tactics of the day, the Huns had been checked. The plain must have looked strange in the dark after so much noise. Fires burned low. Horses stood with heads bent. The wounded called out in many languages. Armor lay scattered among the trampled grass. Men who had spent the day trying to kill one another now stared into the same night sky, each side measuring what had been gained and what had been lost. For the Romans and their allies, victory did not feel simple. They had survived. Yes, they had stopped Attila's westward momentum. Yes, but they had done so at terrible cost, and not by Roman strength alone. The old empire had required a coalition of peoples once considered enemies to hold the line. Even in success, the battle revealed how much the world had changed. For Attila, the battle marked something more subtle than ruin. It marked the edge of certainty. Until then, his name had traveled with the weight of inevitability. Provinces burned, tribute followed, and fear seemed always to prepare his path. On the Catalonian plains, fear met resistance and did not prevail cleanly. His army remained formidable, but the aura around it had shifted. Britannica is careful in its language. The battle checked the Hunnic advance in Europe, though traditional casualty numbers are likely exaggerated, and Attila's horde was unlikely to have permanently transformed the deep Latin and urban character of Gaul, even had it gone further. That caution is wise. History becomes clearer when we resist turning every battle into the single hinge of civilization. Yet some moments matter not because they decide everything, but because they reveal that an empire momentum can indeed be resisted. And still, the story did not end there. Attila was not finished. A man like him, ruling the sort of empire he ruled, could not simply return home and accept diminished prestige. Victory fed power. Movement fed loyalty. Delay invited doubt. The Hunnic court, the nobles, the subject peoples, all would watch to see what came next. So after the long day on the plains, after the dust and cries and withdrawal into camp, Attila turned southward in the year that followed. Gaul had not yielded. Italy, perhaps, would. Chapter 11. The smoke over northern Italy. In 452, Attila crossed into Italy. If Gaul had given him resistance, Italy offered something more haunting, the symbolic heartland of Roman memory. Even in decline, even in administrative fragmentation, Italy still carried the prestige of the old empire. Its roads, cities, churches, villas, and ancient names held more than practical value. They held inheritance. To enter Italy as an invader was to step not merely into a province, but into the imagination of Rome itself. The land he entered was rich, though strained. Northern Italy was threaded with old Roman cities, commercial routes, cultivated plains, and the accumulated labor of centuries. Yet the Western Empire no longer possessed the easy capacity to defend it. Aetius, who had checked Attila in Gaul, could do little to halt him here. Britannica notes this plainly. When Attila invaded Italy in 452 and sacked a number of cities, Aetius was unable to stop him. Aquileia became the great symbol of the campaign. The city, one of the most important in the northern Adriatic world, was besieged and eventually destroyed. Later generations would remember its fall with a near-mythic sadness, as though the breaking of its walls announced the breaking of something older and larger. Other cities suffered too: Padua, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, Milan. The names survive like embers in the sources. Imagine the approach of the Hunnic host through summer haze. The air is hot. Dust clings to skin. Civilians flee along roads lined with fruit trees and drainage ditches that Roman engineers once believed would outlast any passing enemy. Bells ring inside churches. Grain is hidden. Household treasures are buried in courtyards. People stand on walls and watch the distant shimmer of movement becoming horsemen. The invasion of Italy also helped shape one of the most enduring images in Attila's legend. The meeting with Pope Leo I. Britannica states that Leo persuaded the Huns not to attack Rome in 452. Later Christian tradition would surround this encounter with miracle and sacred authority, imagining the apostles themselves appearing above the Pope to terrify the invader. Yet historians are more cautious. Attila's withdrawal likely had several causes. Famine and pestilence were ravaging Italy. Supply lines were stretched. Disease may have troubled the army. The Eastern Empire was no passive spectator and could threaten Hunnic interests elsewhere. Still, the meeting mattered. We can picture it in a wide northern landscape, perhaps near the river Mincio, where embassies and sacred authority converge beneath a heavy sky. On one side, the Bishop of Rome in formal dignity. On the other, the ruler whose name-made provinces empty themselves in fear. Around them, attendants, guards, interpreters, standard-bearers, all standing at the edge of history's theater. What was said between them, we do not know. Silence survives where words once stood. That silence is part of the power of the scene. It allows later ages to imagine what they need. Moral triumph, political realism, divine warning, pragmatic negotiation. Perhaps all of these touch the truth in some degree. A ruler under logistical strain may still respond to ceremony. A bishop may serve as diplomat as much as pastor. A withdrawal can be both strategic and symbolic. What matters is that Attila did withdraw. He did not take Rome. For Christian memory, this became a story of sacred intercession. For political history, it became a reminder that even the most feared conquerors remain vulnerable to supply, disease, time, and competing priorities. The greatest riders on earth still need fodder for horses. They still depend on the health of man. They still calculate when a march becomes too costly. There is something almost gentle in the lesson if one listens closely enough. Even terror has limits. Even the storm tires. Even the man who made emperors pay in gold had to turn back before the practical truths of the earth. Yet withdrawal is not the same as peace. Northern Italy had been scarred. Cities had burned. Refugees had moved. Rome's weakness had been displayed again. And Attila, though he turned back, remained alive, dangerous, and still planning. The new Eastern Emperor Marcian had refused to continue the subsidies agreed under Theodosius II. That alone was enough to point the Hunnic gaze once more toward the Balkans and beyond. So when Attila left Italy, he was not a defeated fugitive wandering into obscurity. He was a ruler returning to prepare again. And then, in one of history's strangest endings, the man who had survived campaigns, negotiations, coalitions, and continents met death not on the battlefield, but in a chamber lit for marriage. Chapter 12, The Wedding Night and the Hidden Grave. The end of Attila's life carries an almost dreamlike quality, as though history itself, after so much thunder, chose to conclude in eerie quiet. In 453, Attila married yet another bride, a young woman named Ildiko. The sources tell us that after the wedding feast, during the night, he died in his sleep. Jordanes, drawing on Priscus, says that he had given himself over to great celebration, and while lying on his back, heavy with wine and sleep, he was suffocated by a rush of blood, likely a nosebleed that flowed down his throat. There was no wound, no assassin's blade in the accepted account. Only the strange stillness of a great conqueror undone by his own bod for a figure so wrapped in legend. The manner of death has always seemed almost too intimate, too human. It resists the grandeur that myths prefer. No last battle, no speech before dawn, no imperial execution. Only a night of celebration, a sleeping body, and then the shocked discovery that the ruler of the Huns was gone. There is something profoundly historical in that. The body remained sovereign over kings. Jordanes tells the story with solemnity. The bride found weeping beneath her veil, the dead king lying without visible wound, the court thrown into mourning. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by later literary framing, the core tradition is strong enough to have endured. Even a life lived amid cavalry, tribute, and terror can end in silence. And then came the funeral. The Huns mourned, but they mourned in their own way. Jordanes describes Attila's body being placed in state within a silken tent, and his people circling him in lament that emphasized not weakness but glory, that no man so great had fallen by the hand of enemies. He was then buried. Tradition says in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbolizing the wealth and war bound together in his reign. Weapons, spoils, and treasures accompanied him. Those who buried him were killed so that the location of the grave will remain forever secret. Whether every ornament of this burial account is literal or partly ceremonial in storytelling, the image is unforgettable. Gold, silver, iron. A hidden grave somewhere in the lands of the Tissot or the Hungarian plain. A ruler once feared by 2 Roman empires disappearing beneath the earth so completely that no later monument could pin him to one place. This hiddenness feels strangely fitting. So much about the Huns remains elusive. their deepest origins, their internal language or languages, the exact structure of their early confederations, the location of famous battles, the resting place of their greatest ruler. They altered Europe dramatically, yet they slip away from marble certainty. Perhaps that is why later memory tried so hard to trap Attila in legend. If history could not give a fixed tomb, story would give him an afterlife instead. Yet in the immediate present of 453, myth mattered less than politics. Attila left many sons. Britannica notes that after his death they divided the empire among themselves and quickly began quarreling. This is the old vulnerability of confederated power. A leader strong enough to hold many peoples together may also prevent succession from stabilizing. While he lives, personal authority substitutes for institutions. When he dies, every subordinate center begins to imagine itself sovereign. The empire that seemed so terrified was about to discover its own fragility. For subject peoples had not forgotten who they were. Goths, Gepids, and others had submitted because Attila's power made submission prudent. Once that power passed into divided hands, obedience could turn quickly into revolt. There is a softness to the air after such a death, a deceptive stillness. Camps do not dissolve at once. Standards do not fall in 1 hour. Horses still graze. Officers still give orders. Gold is still counted. But underneath, the fabric has begun to tear. Brothers mistrust brothers. Allies test boundaries. Former subordinates whisper to one another. The empire continues to look whole for a moment longer than it truly is. It is tempting to think of history as a chain of vast public events, but so often its course bends in private rooms, a marriage chamber, a breath cut off in sleep, a grieving camp before dawn, a succession dispute unfolding before the funeral embers are cold. Attila's death did not instantly erase the Huns from Europe, but it removed the one figure who had made their coalition seem irresistible. The grave was hidden, the weakness was not, and soon, on a river whose location is still uncertain, the peoples once bent under Hunnic rule would rise together and break the empire apart. Chapter 13, The River Nideo. After the death of Attila, the Hunnic Empire entered its most dangerous season. At first glance, nothing may have seemed entirely changed. The same broad plains remained. The same subject people still owed service. The same prestige of past victories lingered over the court. But prestige without a commanding center is like a fire without new wood. It glows and fades. Britannica tells us that Attila's sons divided the empire and at once began quarreling among themselves. Their subjects, seeing an opportunity, revolted. The result was a series of costly struggles that culminated in a great battle on the unidentified river Nideo in Pannonia, where a coalition of Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, and others routed the Huns. The uncertainty of Nideo's exact location is strangely appropriate. The battle stands at the edge of firm geography and clear consequence. We may not know exactly where the river ran, but we know what happened there in political terms. The empire of Attila shattered. Imagine the mood among the former subject peoples. For years they had fought under Hunnic command, paid tribute, sent sons, endured oversight, and measured every decision against the will of a distant but omnipresent king. Now that king was gone. His heirs lacked his gravity. Old humiliations resurfaced. Ambitions long suppressed returned like birds at spring. Foremost among the rebels in later tradition is Ardaric, king of the Gepids, often remembered as one of Attila's most capable subordinates before becoming a leader of resistance. Whether every later detail about his motives is precise, the broader truth remains. The very peoples who had helped sustain Hunnic power now turned against it. This is one of history's oldest reversals. An empire that expands by incorporating many nations also creates the possibility of many nations uniting against it once the center weakens. The battle at Nideo, as Jordanes later describes it, was fierce and decisive. Hunnic dominance in the Carpathian Basin collapsed. The sons of Attila were driven apart. What had seemed a terrifyingly durable structure proved vulnerable once charisma and fear were no longer concentrated in one ruler. There is a melancholy lesson in the fall of the Huns after Attila. For all the dread they inspired, their European empire was brief. Their first explosive arrival near the Roman world came in the late 4th century. Their period of highest dominance belongs mainly to the early and mid-5th. Within just a few years of Attila's death, Their position as a major continental power had largely broken apart. But brief does not mean unimportant. In those few generations, the Huns had transformed the map of Europe. They pushed Goths into Roman territory. They helped accelerate the migratory and military crises of the late Empire. They drained Roman treasuries through tribute. They forced both Eastern and Western courts into new patterns of diplomacy and coalition. They revealed how mobile power could humble monumental states. Even their collapse left a reshaped landscape behind. After Nideo, some Huns remained in smaller groups. Some were absorbed into other peoples. Some continued to serve in armies or drift across the margins of imperial and post-imperial politics. Yet the Huns, as a commanding political unit, were gone. The Eastern Roman government, Britannica notes, closed the frontier to them, and they ceased to play a significant role as an independent force, gradually disintegrating as a social and political whole. This pattern tells us something profound about steppe empire, and perhaps about all empire. Power held together by momentum can rise very quickly. It can also collapse very quickly when the channels of reward, loyalty, and fear stop flowing through one effective center. Institutions matter. Succession matters. The Huns under Attila mastered expansion. They did not master continuity. And yet, even as the political form broke apart, the memory remained unusually strong. Why? Partly because the Huns arrived at the exact moment when Rome was already anxious about its future. Partly because Attila's name was memorable enough to outlive his state. Partly because later peoples, chroniclers, and storytellers used the Huns as symbols of divine punishment, of barbarian terror, of the wild edge of history, of resistance, of antiquity's end. The river Nideo, then, is not only the site of defeat, it is the place where history turns from event into memory. The empire sinks beneath the surface. The legend begins to drift downstream. Chapter 14, what was real, what was remembered. Now that the dust of campaigns is settled, now that Attila is buried in secrecy and the Hunnic Empire has broken apart, we can turn gently to one of the most important parts of any historical journey. What was real and what was remembered. The Huns have suffered, perhaps more than many peoples, from the exaggerations of both fear and romance. Ancient Roman writers often painted them in monstrous colors, making them seem less human and more like a force of nature sent to punish civilization. Later medieval tradition transformed Attila into a figure of epic legend. Modern popular culture has often flattened all of this into a single image, savage riders pouring endlessly from the east. History, as usual, is quieter and more complicated. What was real is that the Huns were a formidable steppe-derived power that entered Europe in the late 4th century, shattered existing balances, and built an empire under Attila that could coerce both Roman halves in different ways. They were skilled mounted warriors, especially famous for horse archery and mobility. They extracted tribute, used terror strategically, and depended on the leadership of a ruling house that reached its peak under Attila. What was also real is that they were not a faceless swarm. Priscus shows us villages with polished boards, rank seating at banquets, embroidered linen, aristocratic households, judicial audiences, and a ruler whose personal austerity impressed Roman eyes. These details do not erase warfare. They restore humanity to it. What was remembered and often exaggerated was the image of total savagery. Ammianus Marcellinus offers valuable evidence about Hunnic mobility and reputation, but his language belongs partly to a Roman literary habit of depicting distant peoples as the inverse of civilization. Modern historians read him critically for that reason. He tells us much about Roman fear, and some about the Huns. Then there is the question of origin. For centuries, many try to draw a clean line between the European Huns and the Xiongnu of Inner Asia. The similarity of names encouraged bold theories. Modern scholarship has tended to be cautious. Britannica says a connection is possible but cannot be substantiated with certainty. Recent genetic work, however, suggests that some elite individuals of the European Hun period did indeed have links to late Xiongnu elites, even as the Hunnic population in Europe as a whole remained highly mixed and diverse. This does not prove a simple, uninterrupted migration of one homogeneous people across 300 years. It suggests instead a more subtle truth. Elements of Inner Asian imperial networks may well have survived within a broader and changing Hunnic formation. What was remembered in Christian tradition was Attila as the scourge of God, a kind of chastising instrument sent against a sinful world. Such language tells us less about his own self-understanding than about the moral imagination of those who suffered from, preached about, or later narrated his invasions. Titles often grow where fear needs meaning. What was real in frontier life was more complex than simple collision. Archaeological work in the Carpathian Basin shows that some people moved between agricultural and pastoral lifeways during the Hun period. This suggests not an impenetrable wall between Roman and Hun, settled and nomadic, but a fluid zone where survival, opportunity, and adaptation could reshape identity. This matters because it rescues us from the oldest trap in writing about antiquity, the fantasy that the world was neatly divided between civilized centers and barbarian margins. In truth, the frontier was full of negotiations. People defected. People intermarried. People copied clothes, weapons, diets, and customs. The Huns could be feared and imitated at the same time. Rome could be admired and resented at the same time. Even Attila himself resists simplicity. He was capable of vast destruction. He extracted gold through force. He led invasions that left deep suffering behind. Yet he was also, as Britannica notes, a persistent negotiator and a ruler whose courtly behavior and personal restraint stood out in the only substantial eyewitness account we have. And so the real history of the Huns is neither the fantasy of pure barbaric chaos, nor the comforting revision that turns them into misunderstood innocence. It is harder, and therefore more interesting. They were empire makers of the steppe. They were opportunists shaped by a mobile world. They were catalysts of migration, crisis, and adaptation. They were a coalition more than a single people in the narrow modern sense. They were feared for good reasons and misrepresented for familiar ones. And above all, they were part of the long story of how the ancient world changed into something else. As we come nearer to the end, we can begin to feel what their legacy truly was. Not merely battlefields, not merely Attila's name, but the deeper alteration they helped bring about in Europe's political imagination. For after the Huns, Rome no longer looked eternal. After the Huns, mobility had humbled monument. After the Huns, even memory itself seemed to ride differently across the old imperial roads. Chapter 15, The Long Echo of Hooves. And now, as the night deepens and the story begins to close, let us step back from the names and dates and ruined walls and listen for what remains. The Huns did not endure in Europe as a stable empire. Their political structure broke apart soon after Attila's death. Their descendants were absorbed, dispersed, renamed, forgotten, or transformed within the many peoples of the post-Roman world. No Hunnic Senate survived. No Hunnic marble capital stood for centuries. No monumental archive preserved their own voice in abundance. And yet they left an echo out of all proportion to the briefness of their rule. Part of that echo lies in what they did to Rome. They did not single-handedly cause the fall of the Roman Empire. History is never so tidy. The Roman world was already strained by internal conflict, economic burdens, military transformation, court politics, and the long difficulty of ruling too much territory with too few certainties. But the Huns intensified existing fractures with remarkable force. They drove other peoples toward imperial borders. They extracted gold from Constantinople. They forced the West into fragile coalitions. They revealed, again and again, how much of Roman confidence rested on conditions that no longer held. The Huns did not create Rome's weakness. They made it visible. That is often what invaders do at decisive moments in history. They arrive not as the only cause of collapse, but as the force that strips away illusion. And what illusion did Rome lose in the age of the Huns? The illusion that frontiers could remain stable through habit alone. The illusion that city walls meant command over provinces. The illusion that the empire's old forms guaranteed its future. The illusion that mobile peoples beyond the frontier were politically simple or strategically naive. When Attila made emperors pay in gold, when Balkan towns burned, when Gothic refugees crossed rivers, when Aetius had to weave barbarian allies into Rome's defense, the old world did not end in one day, but it began to sound different. The echo of the Huns also survives in how Europe imagined the steppe thereafter. Later nomadic powers would be compared to them. New invaders would be called Huns by frightened enemies, even when the label made little ethnic sense. The name became shorthand for speed, terror and the collapse of settled certainty. This is the burden of fame and history. Once a people becomes a symbol, it is reused long after the people themselves are gone. But the deeper lesson of the Huns is not merely fear. It is movement. They remind us that history is never held entirely by stone, archive, and wall. It is also carried by saddle memory and open land. The great grasslands of Eurasia, so easily ignored in stories centered on cities, have again and again produced powers capable of remaking the settled world. The Huns were one such power. Brief, bright, disruptive, elusive. And perhaps that elusiveness is part why they fit so naturally into the quiet currents of bedtime history. They come to us partly in shadow. We know them through fragments, through hostile observers, through archaeology, through later legend, through the silence of a hidden grave, and the plain cup in a royal hand. They are both near and far, historical and dreamlike, concrete in impact, uncertain in origin. Now, gently, let us return to where we began. The steppe at dawn, the long grass silvered with frost, the distant rhythm of horses moving beneath a pale sky. Close your eyes once more. If they have opened, feel the centuries settling softly behind you. The Roman roads are quiet now. The camps are gone. The tribute gold has long since been melted, buried, lost, or transformed into other kingdoms' wealth. The names of officials have faded. The banners have rotted. Even the exact river of Nideo and the grave of Attila remain uncertain. But the story remains. It remains as a reminder that power is not always where civilization expects it to be, that the edges of the map can become the center of history, that empires can appear solid and yet tremble when touched by movement from beyond their assumptions, that people feared as barbarians may possess courts, customs, discipline, and political intelligence unseen by their enemies, that myth grows where understanding fails, and that the historian's work is to walk calmly into that mist and listen for human voices. And now, slowly, gently, return to the present moment. You have traveled to the grasslands and the river frontiers, through wooden halls and burning provinces, through gold-laden treaties, embassy roads, battle plains, and secret burials. You have followed the Huns from uncertainty into empire, and from empire into memory. Let the hoofbeats grow faint. Let the banners disappear into evening haze. Let the old names drift like smoke over distant water. The night is quiet again, and somewhere beyond the last horizon, where earth meets sky without wall or border, the steppe is still breathing beneath the stars.